Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Michele Colli. I'm from Force Technology, IoT Data and Services Innovation. And well, before we start, a couple of practical things. Turn off cameras and microphones as usual. And if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat. And from the chat, we will read them. My colleague Lennart will read them and ask the questions to me at the end of the webinar. Mess Johansson is here helping me from the technical corner, so we can just get started. First of all, good morning again. I'm Michele Colli from Force Technology. And I'm sitting in iDemoLab, which is partly a laboratory, partly a showroom that we have, where you can see in the background a number of components that we use. It's mostly electronics that we use when we develop IoT prototypes for our customers. And this iDemoLab is part of the IoT Data and Services Innovation Business Unit, where we work with both product development, IoT and smart product development, Industry 4.0 and introduction of IoT in production and supply chains, and business model innovation. What we will discuss today in about 20 minutes, and then we will have 5, 6, 7 minutes for questions. It's an approach that we use pretty extensively with our customers called digital factory mapping. And it's basically a new approach to analyze production and supply chain operations from both a physical perspective and a digital perspective. So I will share the presentation with you. I will share my screen, and we will try to figure out what is this about, why is this valuable, in which cases we apply it, and so on. First of all, what is the problem that small, medium, and also large companies are need to tackle when they deal with Industry 4.0, when they deal with the introduction of digital technologies in production and supply chains? There are two main issues that we identified, both from research and talking to our customers. The first problem is that they do not know where to start. As you know, the Industry 4.0 agenda is particularly wide, and there is a wide scope, and it's not always clear from which technologies a company, a specific company in its specific context and with its specific needs and goals can get the most benefit. So it's fundamental for companies to understand where it's better for them to start, which projects to address in their specific context. The second issue is that it's challenging for companies to quantify the potentials of these initiatives. They know that, well, we have 3, 4, 5 different initiatives, 3, 4, 5 different digital technologies that we could implement in our production or supply chains, and we know that they can bring value, but it's very difficult to understand how much value they can bring. But it's fundamental to understand the numbers if we want to formulate a business case and if we want to manage in the end to allocate some funding to perform these projects. So number one, they need to understand where to start, and number two, they need to understand the potentials, the numbers. So how do we do it? Well, there was a lack of approaches to help companies in systematically doing that. So we developed, starting also from some PhD findings, this new tool called digital factory mapping, which is bringing together both the lean philosophy and the new digital maturity concept. And it has 3 objectives. Number one, to help companies in identifying the best improvement opportunities, not only some improvement opportunities like normal digital maturity assessments do, but the best improvement opportunities for that specific context. Number two, the objective number 2 was to be able, again, to quantify their potential. So how much value is each digital innovation initiative we identify bringing on the table in a specific context. What are the numbers behind that? And number three, the third objective is we would have liked to be able to define in the end, at the end of the analysis, very specific digital innovation projects, not just introduce RFIDs in production, but something very specific that companies could have taken and started right away. How does it work? If we look at this digital factory mapping approach, how does it work? Well, it's divided into two phases. The first phase is called physical analysis, and it's strongly based on lean. In fact, it's about performing basically a value stream mapping of the scope processes. So we will figure out that for one company, the competitive advantage is built on production floor processes, or it's built on maintenance processes. So we will define a scope, and then we will perform a value stream mapping of all the processes. So we map each single process across, for instance, production floor operations, and we map for each single process a number of key parameters that we need to have if we want to understand what is the performance of these processes. Examples: lead time, number of resources deployed in the process, takt time, downtime, utilization rate, quality ratio, etc., etc. So we have a number of key parameters that are interesting. We need to map them for each one of the processes. Why is this interesting? Why do we start with this phase? Because we want to identify where are the bottlenecks across our operations. It wouldn't make any sense to improve any process in other points that are not the bottleneck, because they would lead to a local optimum, but the overall performance of the processes would remain the same. The only way to improve the overall performance is to focus on the bottlenecks. So here we want to identify what are the bottlenecks, how big are the bottlenecks, because we have the parameters, so we can understand how big they are, how much are we losing in that bottleneck. So we also have a feeling of how much we can gain if we solve that bottleneck. This is nothing new under the sun, because this is classic lean philosophy, classic lean toolbox value stream mapping. The new part is the second phase, what we call digital analysis. And this is more focused on identifying, okay, what are the digital potentials? What are the digital possibilities we have to improve those bottlenecks? How do we do it? What is the analysis about? Well, we map all the information flows that support the execution of each one of the processes we map. So for instance, we will have process one, which is welding. Well, we will have maybe a welding operator that execute the process, which needs a number of information to execute the process. For instance, he will need to know what is the order number he is processing right now. So he will need maybe to either open the ERP system and check the order number, or receive a piece of paper from the process before him to figure out what is the order number. He or she will need information about the setup parameters of the welding tools. And how does he do that? Well, he opens a database or an Excel arc with all the setup parameters according to the welding process. And then maybe he will need to know which component has to be welded afterwards, to know if he has to do some changeover or not. So he will ask the operator from the previous process, well, what is the next component? So there are a number of assets that are providing the information, and you can see them in the bottom, these squares, a number of assets that are providing this data in it. There are a number of information flows that will get to him or her. And after we map them, we will map how much resources and time are spent to process this information. Of course, it will take time to process this information. How much? How much are we losing to process this information? So this is what we do. Why do we do it? Because we want to identify, first of all, which assets have a very low digital maturity level. So have very few data processing capabilities. For instance, it's pen and paper, so zero digital processing capabilities, and we lose a lot of time in taking care of that. But we also want to map what are the data processing capabilities of who use this information. Sometimes we have an ERP system that provides us information in a digital form, but still we are printing our piece of paper and we are moving this piece of paper from process to process. So we are looking for the digital maturity both of the assets and also of the operators of who is performing the process. What are these digital maturity levels? We map this digital maturity of these assets and people, but what are them? Well, we have a reference table that come from research, which highlights this digital maturity progression. So we have a number of stages with these digital maturity levels, and we use this to map our digital capabilities, the digital capabilities of our assets that go from a 0 level, so we have no digital data, we have pen and paper, or we are talking to our colleague to get the information and so on. We have a basic level where we both generate and store digital data, but it still takes a manual effort to retrieve them. So for instance, we are typing data into an Excel arc, and then when we need this data, we need to look for the right Excel arc, open that, and find the data point we need. Then we have a transparent level where we have, for instance, dashboards that are automatically showing us the data we need when we need it. We have then an aware level when we also have analytic tools in place. So for instance, we are using correlation tools, we are using machine learning to process the data we collect, to have to augment our knowledge, to have more insights from our data. And finally, there is an autonomous level where we don't need to process the data, but we also don't need to use the data because data are used automatically. So everything is autonomous here. And of course, if we look at our production situations, supply chain situations, we know that we have most likely for different processes, different maturity levels. So we need to identify them and map them. Both to identify again where we have a very low digital maturity, so we need to think about investing in new assets or increasing the digital maturity, but also to identify where we have a mismatch between what are the digital capabilities, the digital maturity our assets have, and what is our actual use of these capabilities. Again, example, we have our ERP system where all the databases are and all the informations are, yet instead of having a screen that shows to the operators on whoever has to use the data, all the data in it, we need to print a piece of paper with the information we need, and then we need to bring it to a production station or to a colleague to have this type of data. And in this case, we have a mismatch between what we have and what we could actually use. An example of applying the digital factory mapping to give you a little bit of a tangible feeling of how it works. Here you can see, for instance, a physical analysis at one of our customers, and you can see the value stream mapping of their processes on the production floor. So you don't have to read that, but you can see the different processes. You can see that for each process you have a number, a small table with a number of parameters, performance parameters that are mapped below that. And by performing the analysis of that, you can figure out where you have the highest stack time. So where the flow is unbalanced, how much the flow is unbalanced. So how much are you losing because you have a bottleneck there? Then you can identify that you have, for instance, a low asset utilization ratio. Since you have a bottleneck, all the assets you have before the bottleneck are working less compared to what they could do. So the utilization is low and the return of investment of the assets is low. Then you can map the intermediate stock, for example. And with this customer, for this customer was fairly important to know how the intermediate stock was piling up here and there before the processes. And we saw that due to the bottleneck, it was piling up to a certain extent, and this implied a certain cost. So we basically identified what was the bottleneck and more or less how much was this bottleneck costing the company. Then we mapped the information flow. And you cannot see the arrows here, but it's the same principle. We simply developed an Excel tool, an Excel program to map this information flow in a more structured way. So on top, there are all the processes, and on the side, you can see all the different information systems where different data are retrieved along the production processes. What is the idea? Well, the idea is to, again, map which informations are retrieved, from where, to support what, how much time is spent to process this information, what is the digital maturity of the assets that are providing us this information, and what is the level of maturity we are actually using. Why is this interesting? Because this helped us, in this case, to identify three main clusters of issues. So three main causes of time wasted to process information. And in this case, all these three causes represented only them about 44% of all the manual processing time in the company. This, of course, leads us to formulating a few project proposals, very specific project proposals, to solve this type of issues and to improve the digital maturity and hence the bottleneck that we identified. Here is an example that we proposed to that company, and it was about digital paper trail. I made you the example of the ERP and the printed paper and how much time it could cost, how much resources it could cost. And one of the identified issues was exactly this digital, this paper trail. So we proposed a practical way to solve this paper trail, making it digital, indicating the goal, the initiative, the potential benefits, and the challenges that have to be considered. What is this journey looking like? Well, there are four main steps, and it starts from an awareness seminar where companies go through an Industry 4.0 seminar, so they can get a feeling of what are the technologies out there, what are the exemplary industrial applications of these technologies, what are the best practices, and then because of that they can decide where they would like to perform the mapping. So maintenance operations, warehouse operations, production floor operations, and so on. Then there is the actual data collection, where on site the parameters for the physical flow analysis and all the information flows data are collected and are mapped. After that, well, of course, we go home and we start analyzing all this information and figuring out where are the potentials, how big are the potentials, which type of initiatives we should perform to solve these bottlenecks using these potentials. And there is then a debriefing session where everything is presented and where the most beneficial projects and the ones that are fitting the best the company strategy are selected. In the end, there is a follow-up session where companies are supported in identifying the capabilities they need to have in place, either internally or externally, to execute, to perform these projects. And the whole time, the time frame of these activities is about 2 months, just to give you an idea of how long it takes. At the moment, actually, there is a new project, a new program, which is co-financed by Industriens Fund, which is the Danish Industry Foundation, which supports small and medium-sized companies and co-finance their digital factory mapping. Maybe meaning that they do not have to pay all of that, but part of that is financed by Industriens Fund, and they only have to pay a share of that. And this is of course because it's bringing a lot of value. Here you can see from 3 companies some statements from them about the value that this brought. And of course, in order to support small and medium-sized companies that have less cash to invest in innovation projects, Industriens Fund decided to support this type of initiative. This was a quick pitch of what is the digital factory mapping and how this type of approach, physical analysis, so material flow mapping, and digital analysis, so information flow mapping, can support the identification of performance improvement possibilities in production, for supply chain and the quantification of the benefits. Any questions from now?
No questions in the chat. So even though you have to be a production company, what about industries? Does it apply to specific industries, or is it broad across?
Well, that's a good question. In our case, we apply this type of approach, this type of tool, mostly with production companies, and also the program finance, co-financed by Industriens Fund for small and medium-sized companies is for production companies. But if you look at this approach, of course, you can see that it's about mapping operations, not about mapping only production operations. So the idea of using value stream mapping and mapping a sequence of process and the critical parameters for each one, and the idea of mapping the information flows can be applied for production operations, but can be applied for any type of operations. It could be used for order management processes. It could be used for logistics processes. It could be used for any kind of processes, as long as they are a sequence of operations and you want to improve their performance. Are there any questions from the participants? I guess that probably most of the companies at the moment has a good understanding of lean. So what we see, at least from our application of the digital factory mapping with our customers, is that when we get to the lean part, it's never completely new. Of course, companies have an understanding of that. Many times companies already have their physical analysis, so the material flow mapping. And in that case, it's really a matter of then going from there and focusing on the information flow mapping. So, of course, this type of approach can be tailored depending on the needs and also on the maturity of the company. But the information flow mapping, as far as we see, that's what is completely new for all the companies we are working with, and also from a research perspective is the new part of the tool.
Can you say something more specific about the project? I'm thinking in terms of maybe calendar time and what the companies should invest time-wise.
The project co-financed by Industriens Fund for small and medium-sized companies, for, let's say, companies that are have less than 250 employees, has a time frame. In total, the whole project has a time frame of 2.5 years. So it has started 1 month ago, and it will last until first quarter of 2024, sorry. Well, companies in general, the project is divided in 2 phases. It's not only the mapping, but it's both the digital factory mapping and afterwards the implementation of the best improvement initiatives that is identified through the digital factory mapping. And well, companies have to invest. What companies have to put on the table is an initial 50,000 kroner to perform the digital factory mapping. All the rest is provided by Industriens Fund. And afterwards, they have to provide a variable amount in cash contribution depending on how big is the project. And this is decided together with the company. So of course it could be 100,000 kroners, it could be 150,000 kroners, or it could be less. It depends on the scope of the project. But to give you an indication, there is in the beginning this 50,000 kroner contribution from each company to have the mapping, and then a flexible contribution depending on the project to implement afterwards.
Well, Michele, actually, I wasn't talking about the Industriens Fund program. I was thinking about a digital factory mapping project in a company in general.
If it's in a normal digital factory mapping project in a company, we saw that for companies, usually the time they have to put into that is about 50 hours. So from then we expect more or less 50 hours to be invested to provide us to attend the awareness seminar in the beginning, to provide us with the information and the data during the analysis, and to attend the debriefing in the end. So yes, about 50.
Thank you.
Good. If there are no other questions, I can thank you all for participating. Of course, these are the contacts. So if this is interesting, if you want to have more information, if you want to receive the presentation, if you want to ask something about the digital factory mapping, of course, feel free to contact us. No matter what, we will send you an email with a follow-up and these slides attached. So thank you all for participating. Bye-bye.